There we go. Okay, Jacques the poet. How did you start writing poetry?
Oh, I was 12 years old. I was reading The Lord of the Rings, and it was about a world that was far away and mysterious and remote. And I wanted to conjure that world somehow, and I guess write myself, out of the world that I knew. And so I wrote a very, very bad poem. I think my mother still has a copy of it somewhere.
Mm.
And then gradually, I studied literature. I read a lot of poetry. Um,
Did you do poetry at school?
I did do poetry at school, and I had good language teachers. I had great English teachers, and they would talk about. They would open up poems, and they would relate it to experience and to their own experience. Um,
So they encourage people to read
so
poetry.
they encouraged you to read, and they encouraged you to live, and that was the point.
Okay.
So that is a fatal connection, you see, because you you know you're experiencing, and you are sort of trying to capture that in in a poem, in something that can move other people.
How do, when you're writing a poem and you're writing a lyric,
Mm.
how do they differ? They do differ.
The inspiration is quite similar, and in both cases you have to make time and space for it. It's not hard to write a poem or a song. The only thing that's hard is to make enough space, enough time in your life for it to happen. You have to be receptive. You have to be there. You have to be present to let it happen. Obviously, a poem looks different from a lyric on the page. My poems don't rhyme as a rule, and so they look different, but it is a similar impulse. They both want to move people.
Yeah, but I mean, a song has got the music to go with it.
True.
A
So you
poem
can
must stand on its own.
so you can get away with a lyric. Many of the songs that I love, you read the lyric on the page, and it's like, that doesn't look like much. You add the music, you really, really have something.
Yes.
I always try to make the lyrics stand on their own, and the music, stand on its own as well.
Okay. What different forms do you use?
So I don't use traditional forms much. I don't write sonnets and villanelles and
Stanzas
things
and
like that. I tend to I tend to
there we are.
I tend to just let the musicality is important. Rhythm is very important. The rhythm is very important. Um, that is what matters. The rhythm of the poem is more important than thinking of that having a regular form that you stick to. Some people find that incredibly helpful to have that discipline. Once they have a sonnet form, they can really say what they feel, what they want to say. It helps them to focus their attention.
Okay.
For me, what matters is that I convey a kind of urgency.
Right.
When I read it and I want to, and it wants to sing, I want to read it aloud. That's a good sign. I read a poem by someone else and I feel like reading it aloud. That's a good sign.
Okay. And when you're writing a poem, does it start with a line, or do you take a subject and say, "Now I'm going to write about this"?
It
Do you ever get a line and you have to get somewhere to get that down before the thought is gone?
it often starts in the middle. I know. Um, sometimes it starts with a story. At the moment, there I write about events that I remember quite a lot.
Okay.
But sometimes it's an experience, a memory, anything goes really. Anything that gets you, anything that moves you,
Your
anything
poetry
anything
must
that gets
move
you
you.
started. It has to. Yeah, I think it has to move you. I think. Um, I like very much to read poems that make me think,
Okay.
the thought content. But I think even more important for me is that it moves me in some way to to laughter maybe, or to action, or to see something differently. But what I'm trying to avoid is that feeling of so what afterwards.
Yeah.
I once had a teacher, a great teacher, was my supervisor. And he had the habit of reading poems aloud he didn't intrude into the way he read poetry. So he would read it in a very sing-song voice.
Mm.
And if I sent him my sort of third-rate efforts and he read it in that voice, by the end of it, I would always feel, so what? And that
You mean
taught
there
me
was no emotion?
there was no there wasn't enough urgency in my words.
Okay.
So I thought, well, how do I write with a kind of urgency that pulls in someone?
Yeah,
So that even if they were not particularly interested, if they were tired, if they were felt close to giving up, that would draw them in, that would make them attend, that would make them sit up and say, yeah, you know what, I think I'll read this one to the end.
Yeah.
And so he helped me. He taught me urgency,
Right.
and I think that's terribly important, because there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff to read. There's a lot of stuff to listen to. So there has to be
Poetry adds, I
urgency.
find that poetry adds color.
Yeah, for me it adds depth. I think, yeah, color,
Depth
yes,
and color.
but depth, and it adds, for me, something like urgency. When I read a good poem, a great poem, I feel that everything is at stake. That this moment and how I hinge from this moment into the next moment, it matters.
I just find the way poets describe something.
Yeah.
I always marvel at it and I think, wow, does
I'm-
that flower really look like that?
Yes.
Whatever.
For me, it's the sound.
Okay.
I listened to the other night. I went to a reading. Is on the Red Wheelbarrow that I helped to host a poetry group, on a Thursday night. And Fanula Darling was reading, and she's one of the very finest poets, I think, writing in South Africa at the moment.
Okay.
And somebody asked her, "Do you write landscape poems, nature poems?" And she said, "No, I think that's great, but I want people in my poems, and I want them talking." And I thought, yes, that's me as well.
Okay. So you write about people
I write about people a lot,
and feelings and relationships.
relationship, and
As an observer or as a participant?
hopefully as a participant. And sometimes you write. Sometimes I write about the limits of what I can experience. The other day I wrote a poem about leaving home, and how important it is to have experiences that you can't have at home.
Right.
And then I record a poem I tried to write about a homeless guy who helped me to find my way home when I lived in Stellenbosch. And what I record in the poem is this earlier poem that I wrote, and it was a bad poem.
Mm.
and I record that. You know, why couldn't I write a poem about someone who was actually homeless and hungry? Here I am, you know, saying, you know, you have to be home, you have to leave home, you have to be hungry.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean? How does it feel to how does that measure up against someone who is really homeless and really
Yeah,
hungry?
but how can you write about something if
And how can you,
don't
yeah,
know how they feel?
it feels, yeah, you am I then just sort of appropriating his experience, you know,
Yeah.
trying to,
Did you speak to him
yeah, I did.
what it's like to
I-
be in that situation?
I did, but he, you know, he was a man of few words. And in the end,
So you just observed and
I observed, and from my sort of middle class, well fed uh, point of view. So what's important to, so often what I write about is my quarrel with myself.
okay.
Yeats said, uh, out of our quarrel with other people, we make rhetoric and politics, but out of our quarrel with ourselves, we make poetry. That's the fight you have with yourself. That's where the poems and the songs are, for me. And so I record places where I fail, where I try to imagine something and I can't.
Okay.
And that's how you get away. There's so much of South African experience I feel I can't write about because I don't know about it.
Yeah.
So what you do then is you record your failure.
Okay.
You say, can I fail better? Can I fail more interestingly? You know.
Yeah. Do you find you have to be in the mood to do a poem, or can you just sit down and say, "Now I'm going to write a poem"?
Absolutely, I have to be in the mood, and I've trained myself now to be in the mood mostly around 6 o'clock on a Monday night,
So that's
and 6 o'clock on a Thursday night.
Those are your composing times.
Those are, yeah, and I've trained my good, and I do that because there are poetry readings on a Monday night and a Thursday night, and some friends and I started a new poetry group at the beginning of this year, called The Red Wheelbarrow, after a poem by William Carlos Williams.
Yeah. Okay.
So I try and bring something to that every week.
Can you tell us about that group for people who don't know about it?
Well, we try and invite poets who are interesting. We try to be diverse in terms of culture and background.
Okay.
We try to be inclusive.
And
So
every week you have the main poet. And
every week we have a main poet who
and
reads
then the open mic.
Yeah, and half an hour to 45 minutes, short break, and then an open mic session where anyone can read.
And at the moment you're doing it on Skype, are you?
It's all on Zoom.
Oh, Zoom.
It's all on Zoom, yeah. And I miss in person.